Thank you for coming again. And again, there's some more space in here. If you feel a little bit crowded at the back, this is a very luxurious place. You can come here. Okay, my name is Yu Hong Hong. I'm the director of the Samuel Tech Lee MIT Real Estate Entrepreneurship Lab. It is a tremendous honor on my part and for the lab to have Professor Weiping Hu to come to speak with us today. We were having lunch with Weiping just now. I thought back the first time we met at a conference, and I look at her right now. She looked exactly the same, and I don't know how she does that. Now, despite being look very young and energetic, her career is incredible. I'm ashamed. I achieved about 1/5 of what she have achieved so far. We are in the same cohort, same generation. Now, Weiping, just to give you a short bio, I think, in fact, most of you know her very well. Weiping is a professor and chair in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. Weiping got her PhD in urban planning and policy development from Rutgers Universities. She just revealed to us that she was accepted to MIT but turned us down. we were not good enough for her. All right, and she also graduated from one of the top schools in China, Tsinghua University, for the master and undergraduate degree. Weiping, very active. Aside from published like crazy, she's very active in serving the planning communities, both in China and the United States. Weiping is now the vice president of the ACSB, American Collegiate School of Planning.
Yeah,
right?
Association.
Association is a very, very big organization. And she was actually, is it still or was? You are the former editor of Journal of Planning, Education and Research. In fact, that position shaped very much what we research on because publication is very critical for young scholar and faculty to get tenure. So she actually has been and was a gatekeeper of many very important academic activities and trajectory for the planning school in the United States. Now, this is a long list, and I don't want to bore you with her credentials. So I would actually have her to tell you today's topic, which is financing China urbanization, which is a very, very important topic that we all interested in. So without any delay, Weiping.
Thank you so much. That was very kind, Hong, and I'm very, I'm flattered and I'm honored. And I've always said coming to MIT, coming to DUSP is almost like coming back home because I've really known a number of faculty here for many years, Karen Polanski, John DeMarshall, Dennis Frenchman, and Jin Hua. In fact, we were talking about the joint MIT and Tsinghua studio, which I participated in 1987, right? I don't know, some of you may not even be born at that time yet. Anyway, so I really appreciate being back here, and I teach just across the street at Tufts, and we certainly will love for any of you to come and join us in some of our activities. We don't have quite as many international students, so it's really excellent to see there's such a contingency and critical mass of that here. And I'm very pleased that you are interested in China, also interested in issues related to planning outside of North America. So what I would like to exchange with you is more of my current research on financing infrastructure and urbanization. And Home probably knows that over the last 20 or some years, I have really studied China in several different topics, one of which is migration and migrant housing and migrant settlements. And so I'd be happy to talk with any of you who's interested in migration issues. I've also been looking at what we call it sort of the innovation economies, right? So in the sense of how firms transfer knowledge and innovation between firms and universities, as well as some of the what we call creative industries. And my third area is this financing issue, particularly in terms of infrastructure. And just really quickly, okay. And so for a number of years ago, I was looking at infrastructure, but at that time, I was primarily looking at how the public sector or how infrastructure was financed through budgeting sort of channels, right? So the public finance. So in the last year or so, I've been sort of expanding that scope into looking at private investment in infrastructure and other types of urban investment. So in this talk today, I wanted to really give you a little bit of a sort of large picture of where China stands in terms of its ways of financing infrastructure in general, but particularly urban infrastructure. I'm not going to look at sort of large intercity highways or airports in a sense, but these are primarily infrastructure items that are within cities. So we're looking at water, sewage, energy, transit, and a little bit telecommunication, and so on. And also to place China in a sort of somewhat of a comparative context, because as I mentioned, as I move from looking at public finance to private participation, you recognize that the emerging countries or the emerging economies are really in the same army with China. That is, they're trying to attract global investors into the infrastructure sector. So how does China do in terms of comparing to other countries? So that's also part of our talk today. And so I hope you'll feel a little bit more sort of situated, even if you don't study China, as I walk you through this talk. So so let's get started with that. So some of you probably have seen the book that I worked with Piper, my colleague, a couple of years ago on the Chinese city. And in that, we really looked at the overall urbanization trends in China. And the reason I'm showing this to you is for you to look at the pace of change and the scope of change. And of course, we will all agree that the definition of urban and the definition of urban population are both very problematic and tricky when you study China, or for that fact, any developing countries. But let's just say that these numbers are somewhat reliable. They also actually are a compromise between some underestimation and overestimation. Nonetheless, China is at the sort of approximate, appropriate level of urbanization, considering its level of economic development. So it is a middle-income country now, and its urbanization level is just about the same as the world as a whole, but that's a huge change from 30 years ago, as you can see. And the number of cities has just proliferated. Of course, many of you also know that is not necessarily an outcome of natural growth. There has been a series of national policies at work that either moved rural jurisdictions into cities or reclassified or rebranded some rural entities into urban. So when you look at these, when you study China and look at these numbers, you always kind of feel like they probably raise more questions than answering them. Nonetheless, at least on paper, we can see the more than doubling of the number of cities and the more than doubling of the particularly very large cities, and then the significant shrinkage of the rural sector at the same time of the rising urban and rural disparity. So that's all sort of what we call the big picture, when you think of urban, why is urban infrastructure important? Why is urban financing important? There it is. Cities are driving the economic growth. Cities are centers of growth. Cities are essentially the center of national policy. And all of which makes it, studying how we actually finance, I keep saying sometimes I'm American or I'm Chinese, I keep saying we, but how Chinese finance such growth. It's actually a really important topic, so I actually hope some of you could get interested in that. And the Chinese urbanization also, very much unlike many countries, is geographically very uneven. And so my story today about financing urbanization is mostly about cities around the East Coast. As you can see, some of the largest cities are on the East Coast. You do have a couple of other clusters here around Chongqing and Chengdu, and then maybe in the northeast, in the Manchuria area, that you might have another cluster. But in essence, you have three very large urban clusters in China around the lower Yangtze River, along the Bohai Bay area, and along the Pearl River Delta area. And this is where you will see the most significant growth of urbanization, as well as really kind of interesting ways, innovative ways of financing urban growth and infrastructure. I did some early research where I looked at how financing patterns, at least in terms of public finance, differ quite drastically across East Coast, Central area, Western provinces, but I'm not really focusing on that today. So this gives you a sense, the overall picture, the regional distribution, and then I want to give you one last context, right? So when you look at urban growth and financing, you want to look at the large physical context. And for many of you who are familiar about China, we know about, it is a authoritarian regime, it's a centralized political system, but really when you look at how money is spent, how resources are allocated, China is actually a very decentralized system. That is, there's a huge degree of fiscal decentralization, but it's very uneven. I want you actually just to see this graph instead of trying to capture all of those words. That is, up to 1994, local government had more money, in a sense, when I say money, but revenues, than they had to spend on services and infrastructure, right? So this is what we call the 剪刀差, right? So after 1994, that really completely turned around, that local governments have less revenues than they have to spend on infrastructure, services, and social programs. Now, that is not to say they actually don't have money. This is fiscal revenue. Fiscal revenues are money that's on the book that have to be recorded as taxes or fees. Anyway, so sort of a more public finance part of the money and budgetary aspect of the local financing picture. So you probably know 1994 was the turning point because of the tax reform. And so if you read about this issue, there's still a big wave of proponents and scholars who continue to push for the fiscal reform to move forward in China, because this leaves a lot of localities with a lot more incentives, not yet, not this one, to actually seek non-budgetary incomes. It also leaves cities outside of the East Coast more scrambling for revenue sources. So, so this is the fiscal context, right? So yes, it's a very centralized country. Yes, it might have a fairly authoritarian political system, but the fiscal picture is quite decentralized. It involves tremendous imbalance between revenues and expenditures, as well as between well-off localities and the poor localities, more into the central and the western part of the country. So with that context, let's look at infrastructure financing in general across different countries. And we know, for those of you who've taken any courses on financing, municipal financing, or infrastructure investment, and so on, these are some of the key types of ways of raising money to invest in the kind of infrastructures I just mentioned, right? Public investment. So in the United States, your main source is property tax of localities, right? Municipal bonds, bank loans, private investment, or other official sources, particularly in developing countries, loans through the World Bank, or infrastructure banks like, BNDES is the Brazilian infrastructure bank at the national level. So these are key ways of financing infrastructure across the world. Now, let's place China in that context across the world. Let's look at how it is different or similar to other countries. Now, this is obviously somewhat of a simplification, and of course, there's a lot more nuance in this. But so in industrialized countries, as I mentioned in the United States, property taxes, right? And that's why you move from one town to the other, you can see the significant differences in quality of schools, in quality of the streets, and so on. So you don't have to go very far. Cambridge, maybe to Belmont, or to Lexington, to Winchester, you see the difference, right? Because each town sets its municipal, tax rate, property tax rate. So that's local taxes. But actually, the largest is borrowing from capital markets through municipal bonds, especially for very large infrastructure projects like bridges, roads, because the upfront investment is very large, and property taxes only come in every year little bit by little bit, and you have to invest a large amount, and so that kind of gets raised through municipal bonds. And then you have some grants and subsidies through the DOT or Federal Transit Authority. And then the smallest part is actually user fees. You charge for tolls and so on. And then you look at other developing countries, you see very similar situation, particularly through local taxes, because to be able to borrow from capital markets requires a system in any particular country that actually operates efficiently as a capital market. You need credit ratings for local municipalities. So that's not always present in many developing countries. Grants and borrowing from banks. Now we look at China is really unique in the sense that many of you have heard about land lease and transfer fees, right? So what are they? They're essentially, because of the Chinese land ownership system in urban areas, which is public ownership and leasehold system, that land, just like in Hong Kong, Singapore, parts of the Netherlands, Sweden, the land lease can generate a lot of revenues, and such revenues are not considered as taxes or fees. So actually the local governments get to keep all of it. And then so we have seen scholars raising the issue of land lease or transfer fees have become a real political issue as well, because there's gerrymandering, as we call it, of annexation, annexing rural jurisdictions into urban jurisdictions so that there's more land to be leased out, right? So land lease transfer fees, I'll show you some numbers in a little bit, are a big part of infrastructure financing. And unlike many other countries in which the capital markets dominate infrastructure financing, China, aside from land lease, bank loans dominate. It's a totally different picture, and you have borrowing far more than capital market mechanisms. And most of the borrowing comes from state banks. And then there are some very small items of local taxes that we can see. So I know, I apologize, this is really small. All you need to look at is the circled part. And the data is also very hard to get. And this is cities all together in China in terms of infrastructure financing. This is revenue as side. This is not expenditure. It's really difficult to match revenues and expenditures when you study public finance in China. It's black box. You actually can't quite match both sheets, so that the balance sheets, you'd actually never see a balance sheets. Anyway, you really don't. It's a black box, right? And so lots of people actually argue that that 39% in 2009 actually is underestimate. And a lot of people believe the land transfer fees actually are much higher in terms of percentage in total revenue incomes for urban infrastructure financing. So actually, so if you look at some of the details, remember the two lines that started to reverse their directions in the early graph. That's the budgetary aspect, right? So as you can see, the budgetary allocation in terms of infrastructure financing is now quite small, 25%, a quarter, right? It's not a lot. And there, like I mentioned, there are a couple of small taxes at the local level that are targeted or what we call earmarked for infrastructure. And so altogether 13%. Fees and user charges are big, right? So you see it's more than 40% here for 2009. I really only pretty much calculated 2009. But this is a little bit misleading because borrowing, I don't have any data here. So this is going to be going down if we include the borrowing. But nonetheless, you also understand from the borrowing aspect, domestic loans are a very large part. These are for mostly the 5 state banks. And then so foreign capital is very small, bonds are really, really small, other kinds are very small. So in studying public finance in China, so these are called budgetary, okay? So because it's either sort of budgetary allocation or local taxes that needs to be recorded or needs to be repatriated into the center, to the national government. These, some of which, the fees are a little bit different. So water resource fee is fixed, so that's budgetary. Infrastructure connection fee is a fixed rate in many ways, and so it's, but land transfer fee actually is considered what we called extra budgetary. That is, it doesn't get really reported, it doesn't get kept, it's repatriated to the center, and so that's where the really darkest black box is, okay? So that's the general picture in urban infrastructure financing through public, more or less, particularly on the top part, financing. So as I mentioned then, land is an important resource for financing urbanization and infrastructure in a number of ways, right? So everybody's heard about these local government financing vehicles, or sometimes in Chinese is called urban development investment corporations. So UDICs, right? These are quasi-public entities. When I say quasi, because they were supposed to be running on market principles, but their ownership is essentially local government. And then so they can raise financing through not municipal bond, but project bond on a specific, let's say a bridge, a tunnel. Then they can raise financing on the bond market for project bonds. Just like any company that have to go public and sell stocks. You can do in a similar way for a project that's yet to be built. So that's called project bonds, but not municipal bonds. And then so when they raise those bonds, so LGFVs or UDICs raise these bonds, how do they promise people that they are going to be able to pay back the bonds? Of course, if you're building an infrastructure that has a user fee associated with it, tolls or water surcharge, yes, that income can be the collateral, right? Another big part of the collateral is future land lease revenues. So a lot of these LGFVs, which I will show you an example in a little bit, actually owns land, the lease right, and then develop land, and then they subsequently use those stake as mortgages or collaterals to get more funds to finance infrastructure projects. So a lot of these LGFVs really are hybrid entities that deal with both the municipal public finance aspect as well as the capital market. And then they are cross-sector, infrastructure, real estate in one place. And that actually is really problematic. I just need to give you some data that could be shocking, but on the other hand, you think about it, it might not be all that shocking, but it's increasingly in the media. That is, these local government financing vehicles have been essentially the key actors that have driven up subnational debts in China. So we're looking at anywhere between 27 to 30% of the Chinese GDP as the amount of debts that these LGFVs and local governments hold. Mostly to state banks, but sometimes also to other investors. This has been a major issue for the Chinese national government. But it's really difficult to stop it, right? In a sense, because now Chinese market, the economy is slowing down, but we have other driving forces that push local governments to continue to invest in infrastructure. So this gives you a little bit better sense of how these local government financing vehicles work. So they have investment from the local governments, from the commercial banks, but that's actually misleading. It's more state banks. Most of the large commercial banks in China are state banks, especially the big fives, right? The communication, I'm sorry, the construction bank of construction bank, 工商银行, right? And then 人行, 国行, and then there's the agricultural bank. Yeah, 农业银行. So the 5 state banks are the biggest investors or lenders to these entities. Then you have individual investors through project bonds. And you might know also in China, increasingly, we have these wealth maintenance products. WMF stands for wealth maintenance products. They're a little bit like trust. They're a little bit like, I guarantee you a return of whatever percentage. A little bit like in the U.S. banks, we have, what does CD, I'm lost blanking, CD stands for certificate of deposits. Or there's a few more in U.S. It's just fixed term investment vehicles that banks guarantee consumers that will earn you better interests than regular savings. Because interest rates in China are really low. Saving in banks don't make you much money, right? So these are also what people started to call shadow banking because it's unregulated. And in China, the banking regulations is really interesting. If you are not a bank that receives deposits, you're not supposed to make any loans. Okay, so let's say, so these WMPs oftentimes may be issued by trust companies, insurance companies, other things, but they don't really receive deposits, okay? They may have people who put in their savings in trust, but that's different from deposits. But they're not called loans, but they call the wealth management products. And that's the whole idea of shadow banking in China. And many scholars actually believe that shadow banking is ultimately a potential to wreck the whole system because the rates tend to be higher and so on. So if you are interested in that, sort of this little corner is something that you can see how it operates. And some of them are informal. Some of them are loan sharks, very high interest rates. Anyway, so that's another source of financing for these local government financing vehicles. And then you see so this is the bottleneck in a way. They all come here, and then it subsequently invests in various different projects. When I have this here, when this graph shows this here, it actually means equity investment. So whenever a private company is directly go into infrastructure projects, it generally is not through lending like bank loans, but rather through equity investment. So that's sort of the main ways of investing. So when we say public finance in infrastructure, or public investment in infrastructure, most localities in China now use these entities as the actual operator for both raising money and investing into these infrastructure projects. So I want to actually first show you this example. So Beijing Capital Group. So every city does it differently. This is the tricky part of studying China. So in Shanghai, for instance, you have two major LGFVs. One is Chengtou, right? Shanghai Chengtou, which is the largest, one of the largest and the very first LGFV. So then Chengtou does every sector except roads in Shanghai. So for roads, you have a separate company. So Chengtou has something like 18 or so subsidiaries that invest in different sectors, water, so on and so forth. And so I went to visit Shanghai's biggest new reservoir. I think it's called Qinglong, but I could be wrong. But essentially, that reservoir provides the source water for more than half of the Shanghai districts. And that was essentially Chengtou's project. But Beijing, on the other hand, has a whole bunch of different LGFVs. Every single sector has one, more or less. And Chongqing, for another very large city, has something like half a dozen LGFVs. So every city works differently. Some is more sector-oriented, some is more comprehensive. So this is Beijing Capital Group that is involved in building a number of metro lines. So Line 4, for instance, is very well known in Beijing because it involved investment from Hong Kong MTR. And then so Beijing Capital Group is the local partner in that joint venture. Because it was a joint venture. It's got involved foreign capital. For investment purposes, Hong Kong is considered foreign, right? It's different from political purposes. So they usually set up what we call the special project vehicle, sort of this temporary entity to gather capital and then invest in Beijing's Line 4. So a number of new subway lines in Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Hangzhou are now involving Hong Kong MTR. Part of the reason is also trying to learn from MTR the way of doing value capture, right? That is using the land surrounding the metro stations to raise more, money by leasing them out, TOD, transit-oriented development, high-density development, and to raise more revenues for the special project vehicle because very few, almost none except Hong Kong MTR, makes money out of operations of the infrastructure itself to sustain the transit company. There's none in the world. Transit is by definition. Okay. Yeah, you do other things, but very few, right? Very few. So Hong Kong's way of doing value capture has been very much sort of attractive to China. And so that is part of the impetus of setting up these various different local government financing vehicles. So as you can see, it's 17 different state firms merged together to form this LGFV. It has a number of different sectors it does. Essentially what we say is cross-subsidizing from real estate to infrastructure. It invests in and outside of Beijing, and then largely through build, operate, and transfer of large infrastructure, meaning public sector would invest in some part of this infrastructure. It essentially would be built by either a special project vehicle or a private operator, and that private operator would operate it for anywhere between 15 to 30 years to 50 years, and then eventually transfer the ownership of that infrastructure back to the public sector, right? And so, like I mentioned, value capture model of Hong Kong MTR is also quite attractive. So there's quite a bit. So this same group also deals with that, acquiring rights to land for other kinds of development. So you say it's an infrastructure investment group, it really does everything, right? So the dilemmas then is land is so important, right? It's not only principal source of capital, it's also future revenue, it's also collateral for borrowing more money. And this is fairly unsustainable for many scholars and policymakers who watch this trend because, if you look at Beijing and Shanghai, which the next graph will show, that there isn't much land left to lease, right? The land lease tends to be 30, 50, 70, and 90 years in term, right? You have to wait that long to actually have another chance of revenue injection, right? Because there is no real property tax, with a very few exceptions that are experimenting with that. And also, there are a whole lot of inefficiencies because sometimes the acquisition of and leasing of land rights tend to go behind doors, and there's quite a bit corruption involved in that. So this actually is not my research, it's somebody else's research, but I think it really shows very well. So if you look at some of the most urbanized provinces, right? Of course, we have Beijing and Shanghai as the cities, and then so you can see there's what we call the transfer-adjusted fiscal gap. Let's just think that's the gap between the expenditures and revenues, right? As I showed you earlier, the two lines in between. It's huge, and land revenue is only projected to fill that much for Shanghai, right? But a lot of other provinces don't have that problem because they got lots of land, but who's going to go there? So if you look at Henan, right, you're not surprised that you have a lot of land, but you're not going to make a whole lot of money out of that land because that's also, so for those provinces where you see the red dot is shorter than the blue bars, is where you're going to see also, I can make this sort of little guess, that you will see a lot more ghost towns and ghost cities where you overbuilt because you have a lot more land, but you don't really have occupants. So that's the problem of relying on land as a significant source to fill the fiscal gap, to finance urbanization and infrastructure.
The blue bar is land area or land revenue? The planned land supply is area?
Land supply, right, land supply.
In terms of
Hectares, right, yeah. This is not exactly money against money, but it's basically showing for a lot of the really desperately, sort of in need places, land is not going to be a whole lot to really fill the gap of the physical gap. Yeah. So we know. So now, so far, we have seen that budgetary allocation is declining, and it's very small share now, about a quarter, right, of financing infrastructure. We also know that land as a long-term source of revenue may not be sustainable, right? So what else, right? Certainly nobody denies there's a lot of overbuilding of infrastructure in Chinese cities. Nobody denies that. But on the other hand, we still have there's still significant need to further invest in infrastructure, particularly in terms of infrastructure that is more environmentally important, so like wastewater treatment. So Chinese cities still have something about 60 to 70% rate of treatment for wastewater. So that's not good, and that causes a huge problem in terms of pollution. And then also in terms of energy security, it's a big concern both at the national and local levels. So what else? So if we look at a number of these other options, municipal bonds, local property taxes, private participation, particularly, well, see, I didn't put these two together because not all institutional investors are private. Some in China are not private, right? Pension funds or even sovereign wealth funds are not always private, right? So it kind of intermingles a little bit here. But we know in China there are only about 10 municipalities and provinces that are trying out municipal bonds. So it's not something that's completely sort of open up. Local property taxes have been debated for many years now. It's been experimented in a few places, but it still hasn't been pushed out as a large-scale policy. So this is actually the next more promising option. So let's look at just that. Let's zoom in on private participation. This is a little bit all over the place because every year, it's primarily because of Brazil that's driving up that 1 year. So we're going to see. But overall, what you're seeing is as large as China is, as high the demand for infrastructure investment is, China is actually very small in terms of the amount of private investment in infrastructure. Okay, so this is a database that World Bank runs. It's free. Everybody can see it. So the other countries are the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa. But Chile is here because Chile, by many investors, is considered one of the most promising markets for private investment. And so that's why it's here. It's a very small country, but it actually has quite a sizable number of public-private projects. This is not exactly what we call public-private partnership, okay? This is just private participation. It could be solely private. It could be partnerships. It could be in other forms like BOT and all of that. So it also kind of gives you a quick look that in China, private participation tends to concentrate in transport, energy, and water to a less extent in terms of investment, in terms of number of projects. Yes, actually the water sector has been open to private participation for a long time, since the late 80s to early 90s. But the amount of investment tends to be small per project, and usually is concentrated in water treatment plants. And you see energy is a big, probably the biggest player. This is actually cumulative. Okay. Yeah, cumulative from this, 1990 to 2012. Yeah. So again, the same other emerging economies. And you see slightly the difference in terms of sector. And so why is China not getting as much private investment, both from within China and outside of China? So that was my more recent field work, asking different investors, both inside and outside the US, about their perception of China as a market for infrastructure investment. Because actually, most people know it's not because of lack of money. There's a lot of wealth, in a sense, stored in the private equity funds, in other types of insurance, sovereign wealth funds. It's the matching of that wealth and quote-unquote viable projects that's been challenging. And so this is kind of almost striking because 20 years ago, I studied manufacturing foreign direct investment in China, right, from other countries. And it was the same story back then. They had to use Hong Kong companies. They had to use Taiwanese company to try to get into the Chinese market. They did not understand the Chinese business culture. It took them a while, all that story. And you see it all over again in the infrastructure space in China today. So these are the types of risks many investors perceive of the Chinese market. So you all know regulatory risk, which is rules change, currency risk, which you also know, and the demand risk is really interesting because China actually, for instance, let me give you an example that has built a lot of intercity highways. But the demand projection isn't always reliable. So you build a highway, will people actually use it? More than that, will people actually pay tolls? Do they get off before they pay tolls, right? So that has not been as stable as a lot of investors would like to see. And it really is interesting how some of the investors, as I talk to them, perceive China hugely different from India. So India, if you build a road, you don't have to worry about demand. What you worry about is actually getting land to actually build the road. So land acquisition in India is very difficult, but land acquisition in China is so easy. They build it, but nobody drives on it, or nobody is willing to pay for the tolls. And then combine that with the regulatory risk. By that, a lot of investors actually mean that They want a regulatory environment in which political interference will not affect, let's see, the rates or the toll rates. So, it was really interesting. Some of the investors will say, oh, it's a national day, October 1st. Oh, let's just say toll-free for 2 days. They are most afraid that kind of political interference, because then you cannot predict, right, for investors, the long-term or even annual return. So one of the goals of our project was to really look at, all right, so their risk, and they're obviously making it a lot harder for investors to say, we're going to invest in China. And they expect this kind of return rates for most investments in infrastructure. That's not in China. So that's in other markets. So what do they do? They put another 5% on top if they want to go to China because of those risks. So they add what we call risk premiums. So that's risk, and that becomes premiums to add on to the expected returns. So we say, okay, so it doesn't look very good. We have to go mid-teens or even up to 20 if you want to invest in China. Is it really possible? Because there have been a whole bunch of firms who have invested in China. So what we did was this is like really preliminary. So we looked at 14 firms to construct our little own China Infra Index, meaning annualized daily return rate, right? So we're looking at 15% as potential, the target. So Hang Seng Index overall, so this includes investment in all sorts of sectors. It's not just infrastructure or just manufacturing. It has all kinds of things. This is Standard & Poor's Global Infrastructure Index. And this is a somewhat of Preqin is this consulting firm in England that tracks infrastructure investment. So they have a infra return index that's across the world, not just China, right? So this is another index compiled similar to Preqin on all firms in China infra. So we actually find these 14 firms. Of course, the choice of firms may be affecting that. It's a reasonable track record, actually, right? We only looked at 2010 to 14. We looked at the closing price of all of the firms over that 4 years period of time. So we thought this was a reputable return rate that we can use to convince investors or, and so we also then did a little bit further in terms of looking at the various different sectors in the infrastructure space in urban China that are more promising for investors. So waste and wastewater, as I mentioned to you, well, water and wastewater has been open to private participation for a long time. So it's very actively, and then all renewable energy. Okay, essentially, this also is driven by the Chinese concern at the national level about energy security and parking lots, for better or worse, ports, but ports not for building, for operating. And then the Chinese sector itself actually is quite active. You probably know that during the Greek economic crisis, one of the Greek ports was actually purchased by a Chinese port operator. So the port operating sector is actually quite active in terms of private participation. And then we looked at a few other potentially quite promising sectors, toll roads, district heating. That will only be in the northern cities, not in the south. Solid waste, airports. And the rest is still very much closed. For instance, telecom or transit. And non-renewable energy, particularly coal, are very much state-dominated, and shale gas is very unpredictable in China. So that does go beyond a little bit urban infrastructure, but this is essentially we're looking at interviews with firms and looking at actual investment portfolios. So anyway, so to wrap it up, and I thought really the current sort of the challenges we're looking at is current financing sort of methods are becoming increasingly challenged. and particularly in terms of the local debts and the encroachment on agricultural land, because so much of this reliance on land has made it very difficult, sort of a relationship between the urban, the peri-urban, and rural, particularly in very large urban areas. And so there are some potentials. Municipal bonds is being talked about, but that again, it still relies on sort of a state apparatus and also building of a capital market. So that's actually moving forward, so I'm not spending a whole lot of time. This is where a lot of Chinese thinking is on to today. That is, so you have these investors, and then we have demonstrated that some of the existing projects are actually quite good in terms of track records. How do you match the investment and the projects, right? And a lot of the smaller cities may not have the capacity to really kind of package a viable pipeline of projects. So in China now, you have Guangdong province or maybe Shanghai, Chengtou, who really want to become these regional infrastructure banks that directly deal with the investors, but then subsequently help smaller cities and districts on their projects. But the challenge, again, as I mentioned to you, because they're not deposit receiving entities, they can't really make loans officially. So they are considered what we call the non-banking financial institutions, and the regulatory framework doesn't work very much to their advantage. So that hasn't been really formed. Now you have seen the setup of the large national infrastructure banks, right? That China is taking a lead. That requires some, again, regulatory innovation. This will do the same, will require the same, some regulatory innovation to allow infrastructure banks to operate. And so you might have heard in China, you have the development bank that actually does project, but if you look more closely, some of the development banks, particularly the state one, they actually set up a private equity fund separately from the bank to do the investment. Okay, so that fund, that private equity fund, PEs are regulated more loosely. But many of the government entities do not want to become PE to operate these regional infrastructure banks. So that's where, it's really interesting how you would think that it's easier to make regulatory changes in China, but it's actually because you have multiple entities regulate the financial sector that it's actually not as easy. And last but not least is really looking at other macro factors, particularly in terms of capital markets. And so China now finally is onto credit rating of municipalities and local governments, but that is still problematic because the domestic source, nobody trusts. The foreign source, and how do you distance? So you have a municipal government, right? Shanghai municipal government. Then you have Shanghai Chengtou. Are they the same? They're really not the same, right? But would you rank the Shanghai municipal government, or do you rank Shanghai Chengtou? So the issue is how far down the road do you rank these sovereign units in terms of credits? So, and then the foreign exchange constraints. It's so interesting that in China today, if you have money as a foreign investor, you may actually not be able to lend to somebody if you're not a bank or you don't have equity investment in an entity. It's not so easy to what we call 接轨, from foreign money to local projects. You have to have equity in that project, meaning you actually are like a co-owner of a project. Okay, that's why in the water sector, all you have been seeing are these big water companies go directly into China's water market and jointly build water treatment plants with local governments. So Veola's done that, Times Water has done that. But let's just say, I just want to give you money. It's actually not so easy to lend that foreign exchange. So foreign exchange constraints actually can be really difficult. And then last but not least is actually you now have quite a bit domestic institutional investors. You think about Ping An Baoxie, right? The insurance company and all of them. But there are lots of restrictions on how much they can invest in other sectors. So And we actually feel, in terms of talking to some of the big actors in China, that this is where you'll have the most potentials, is to get domestic institutional investors to go in first before you get, So some of the most active institutional investors outside of China are these. So if you think of the Canadians, insurance companies, or you think of sovereign wealth fund from Singapore, or a sovereign wealth fund from the Middle East. Those are the key institutional investors. To really attract them, you have to prove that domestic investors are willing, and there's a good track record. So that's some of the things I'm still working on. So it's sort of ongoing work, and that's the end. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Weiping, for a very interesting talk. Okay, so let's open the floor for Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Burning questions?
Or not burning questions.
I have this exploding question, but I want to hear from you first. Jinghua.
Yeah.
I think you see hands over there. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for the talk. I have a question about you mentioned the foreign funds. If they go to China, they put a risk premium 5% to it. One important reason for that is the perceived regulatory risk.
Right.
Yeah. The two questions on that. One is there a variation in terms of the regulatory risk between different sectors?
Yes.
Two is, do you see the reform and the Congress we are having now is attempting to reduce the regulatory risk and make it more stable, more transparent?
Really good question. Actually, yes, it's really interesting. So I talked to someone who really worked a lot with one of the biggest foreign investors in the infrastructure space. Now he has his own private equity firm in Hong Kong, and he is involved in renewable energy, particularly nuclear. And he basically said, we never diversify. We focus on nuclear, or the second line is wind farms, but still it's all all renewable energy. He said, precisely because I have to know everything about energy sector. I have to cultivate really good relationship with the Ministry of Energy. Every sector is different. Every sector's regulations vary in terms of, particularly renewable. You have the green credits, you have all of that. How do you operate? How do you get back onto the state grid, and so on? I guess it's called, state grid. So he doesn't do anything else but renewable. But he has worked on many sectors before. But so he's not the only one. But I thought his comments were really, really insightful on that it is very challenging to try to comprehend. So for instance, Maguire, which is the single largest player, private player and international player in the infrastructure space in China, hasn't done very well because of that challenge. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't even go in by itself. It goes in as a joint venture with Evergreen, right? And so it still doesn't do as well. And then your second part about whether it's getting better, the challenge has a lot to do with how at the local levels, it's so different every place. And so the investors I talk to, essentially most of them don't want to deal a lot with local governments. Because every province is different. And even at the national level, there has been sort of back and forth reversal. For instance, in China now, there's a regulation at the national level that no rate guarantees may be given to foreign investors on infrastructure projects. And that was possible before 2010, but in 2010 that was reversed and it hasn't changed. So yes, there's a lot of local variations, but there are also significant grip at the national level. And so there have been even though water is very open as a sector, but there have been projects that have gone to courts. Or the municipalities actually have to buy back at a cost the rights that have been concessioned out because the investors simply throw their hands and go to court. And then, yeah, the regulatory risk is absolutely the biggest one as perceived by investors. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm kind of new to China research, but my question has to do with the relationship between these different models of infrastructure investment and the implications on land use regulation, because it seems clear that if you're relying on land lease fees, that there's some real implications in terms of how that might impact land use planning, land use regulation. And I wonder if you could just speak to both that issue, but then also how those issues might change with these shifts in infrastructure finance that you're seeing. Like if we go towards more of a model where there's more international and private investment going into financing infrastructure in Chinese cities, what are the implications on that relationship between land use and infrastructure?
Yeah, good question, and big one. Yeah, I think maybe Hong knows more about that than I do. So this part as sort of the land lease as a revenue source is only one aspect that significantly affects regulation, land use regulation. Another one is actually the national policy and the concern about food security. So there's been a lot of a set of serious different policies on how to maintain the stock of arable land. And that forces a lot of municipalities to stay with a quota system that you cannot acquire agricultural land. So that does leave so both forces are at work in terms of driving the land use changes. So we have seen some tightening up. For instance, in Shanghai, it's been going on for a while now, is that you may get the land lease right, but if you don't develop in a certain amount of time, usually 2 years or 3, then the land may be taken back because it cannot really be inactive for that period of time. And then also the authority to grant land lease rights have been coming back and forth between municipal governments and sub-municipal district governments, because big cities like Shanghai have multiple districts. And so because the decentralization of power, the land was perceived to be easily given out, and then that power was then re-centralized back to municipalities. So that happens in a lot of cities, that back and forth, who has really the power. And then subsequently, the national government in 2005, I believe, required all land lease transfer to go through a market, open, transparent process. We call it 招牌挂. So either bidding or other kinds of. But still, when we look at the data, I think something like by 2013, something like 40% of land lease transfers were still not through market mechanisms. So I think So my short answer to your large question is what's gonna change if this is not going to be a major source of revenue. This is not the only pressure point. The land regulatory system requires both in terms of what do we call it? More, I wouldn't call it innovative or creative, but some kind of more systematic thinking and planning, because the World Bank actually created a report around 2008 that looked at land use density in Chinese cities, particularly right outside the central areas. And they really concluded, given as much land is scarce, density is actually not that high once you get out of the downtown area. So if you look at FAR, floor area ratio of suburban development in many large Chinese cities, it's certainly not as high as places like Tokyo, Seoul, in Korea. And so there's the issue about how do you actually develop, in terms of compact and all of that. So the planning system needs to do more in terms of looking at how city should actually evolve, spatially expand, And so now there's a huge issue of sort of leapfrogging and fragmented development in Chinese cities outside the central area. And that's so that isn't really related to this in a sense because it's the same amount of land, but they're developing in a different way. Yeah, so this is just one pressure point.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for sharing. I have one question. Like in your presentation, I think you didn't mention the PPP model. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is really interesting. So public-private partnership, in the United States tends to be a little bit more clear in terms of what it involves, right? In China, in fact, as of last year, I was talking to a number of policymakers and scholars, particularly those involved with the Ministry of Finance, which defines all of these. PPP is really difficult to translate into Chinese. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Actually, it's never translated. It's just called PPP, right? Because 公私合营 means completely something else in Chinese context, right? So PPP I don't believe is ever translated. It's the same way as the Chinese would today. When they say apps, they say APPS. They don't say apps in Chinese. They don't say it, right? Am I right? Yeah. For those of you who know how it works. So because so let's say that line 4 in Beijing, so it involved Beijing Capital Group, it involved Hong Kong MTR, right? It involved another private entity. So the Chinese call this PPP. If you're American, you don't think that's PPP. It's all government entities, or at least every single actor has some government stake in it, right? Beijing Capital Group is not private. Hong Kong MTR is not private. Quasi. So all you have is quasi-private, quasi-public. So yes, there have been quite a bit PPP in China, the way that so I've actually done a paper for the bank office in Beijing looking at the various PPP projects, particularly in the water sector as well as in transport. In the water sector, you do have PPP. What you have is municipal water bureaus with some of the key water companies. They've done well, and most of the foreign water companies have backed out of China because that space has become very competitive and domestic operators are becoming very good. So there's a lot of need for foreign capital. But in the transport sector, you have the toll roads. Yes, we've done PPP, right, with the Gordon, Wu's investment from Hong Kong, the intercity highways. But in transit, particularly in transit, you don't have true nature of PPP in China. So if you talk to, Elliot Scaler, who's at Columbia, who does a lot of work overall on PPPs, he doesn't believe there's a PPP in China. It's because, a lot of these, so Beijing Capital Group will be considered quasi, but it really has a lot of public. So this is actually something that in China has been going under discussion, how to actually frame it. This, as a scene from its original meaning in English.
Hi, thanks. You've talked a bit about the collateral risk and emphasized the regulatory risk, but it would seem, especially in light of China slowing down, that you could imagine the sort of credit agency that differentiates type of investment. So some with is likely to be a fast payback or defined product, as opposed to other areas, real estate development. It would seem like there'd be vast differences in the sort of fundamental risk, not just sort of what the regulation is going to do, but it's in response to the fundamental risk. And I just wondered if you could differentiate that, because the picture at the end, you were talking about other sources of capital, what you need to do to get more capital, sovereign funds or foreign. But it would seem from your talk that the issue isn't really attracting capital. The issue is sort of systematizing the treatment of the risks associated with investment.
Right.
And that it isn't just a sort of regulatory risk. It's that there are big differences in the fundamentals, and some clarification of that might at least differentiate the problem so that certain areas have no problem raising funds, and then the government can focus its attention on the other aspects.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So there are like at least couple of, I mean, I'm not sure I can fully answer your point. I think it's a really good point. At least two aspects that I think will be relevant. One is what sectors tend to offer you the more reliable fundamentals, right? So, and that's why I was really kind of intrigued by some analysts from International Finance Corporation, you know, the multinational institutions that look at different countries and then look at China, right? So things like solid waste management, right? Or things like district heating. These are things that are very, or even pipeline updating, right? So in China, in fact, you don't see that because most local governments are not willing to invest in it because it's huge investment and there's no cash flow associated with that, right? But district heating and solid waste treatment have cash flow associated with it. So for infrastructure services that can have steady cash flows, tend to fare a little bit better in terms of attracting investors. Airports is tricky because there's so much, for instance, one of the significant, there are two sovereign wealth funds from Singapore. One of them was originally invested in the Beijing capital airport because they, built a new one, right? They backed out. They essentially say there's too much interference in terms of regulatory, or not even regulatory, political interference. So they backed out. And so most of the investors aren't necessarily looking at a very high rate, but they actually believe that dealing with governments in some ways should give them some guarantee, except they feel that when you come down to local governments, so my second aspect to your comment is that it's basically Wild West in China when you go down to local governments. And that's why now the thinking is about doing these infrastructure banks, or to sort of create these intermediaries in the infrastructure space that can offer some sense of stability. And so there's a packaging of risky projects versus the more reliable projects in the pipeline to offer to investors. So that's also part of the thinking, I guess. So I'm not sure if I answer your question, yeah.
Professor Wu, I have a question about the, as we all know, China has entered into the new normal. The central government put forward, we need to be through a provide side reform.
Supply side.
Yeah. But as far as I'm concerned, many Chinese cities are facing a very big problem, that is urban shrinkage, especially in northeast regions. So you just mentioned there is a gap between the infrastructure investment and the revenue. So how did the local government respond to this situation? I mean, in terms of the infrastructure investment and the but more and more people leaving their city to other places. So
yeah, you're right. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, that I didn't bring a slide on the early work that I did that shows that cities of different size, as well as different geographical locations, do very differently in terms of where they get funds to finance infrastructure. So, but in general, cities that are smaller and cities are more to the west and the central areas tend to rely more on fiscal allocation, which means government revenues to build. They have less of ability to raise through land use fees or other fees for fund. And that's sort of more from the numbers side, right? So, which suggests that the levels of service in those cities are going to be lower, right? Because you have less money. But anecdotally, that we have heard a lot of stories, and in fact, I have interviewed a few players who are involved in that, is the privatization of infrastructure. So you essentially let private entities develop such infrastructure. For instance, you guys all know CITIC, right? CITIC is the very large non-state bank, investment bank. CITIC has a real estate program, or actually not even a program, it's a company, right? Essentially, it's subsidiaries of CITIC. That is now doing a whole big new city out in Zhuhai. But Zhuhai is not a shrinking city for that matter. But it just shows you that CITIC is developing not just housing, but infrastructure, everything. They're building a new town. I mean, new town in the old days are built by the government. Now in China, they're built by private developers. These private developers, and some are state, some have state. So China Development Bank, for instance, has a private equity arm that does similar project. They may not do the whole new town, but they do a whole big district that involves infrastructure, involves other kind. So in many of these shrinking cities, either you have much lower levels of service or you privatize infrastructure. That's how most municipalities have responded, essentially. I mean, there isn't a whole lot of other way of doing it.
If I may, I mean, of course, you're talking about urban infrastructure mainly, but if you talk about infrastructure happening on the urban fringes, there are a lot of experiments going on in southern part of China, particularly Guangdong, of which the collective organize or assemble land ownerships and form a corporation. The corporation itself will replan the entire neighborhood with public infrastructure put in place, and also subsidizing the costs of infrastructure by developing real estate, residential real estate, or commercial real estate. So this is happening in Guangdong like wildfire.
And they are mostly what we call, interestingly, they probably all used to be rural entities, right? Because they then have the ownership of the collective land.
At the fringes
Yeah.
of the city, they are under pressure of development. But as
Right.
you point out correctly, because of the restriction of farmland conversion, they are being restricted from doing sort of enter into the urban market. So this collective takes the issue into their own hand and develop both the infrastructure and real estate to capture the value created by their own investment.
But the trouble with that is the housing they sell is called 小产权房, because then you do not actually have the ownership. And that happens in Beijing too, because then they sell it to people, people buy it, but they really don't have the ownership, the proper formal ownership. Yeah.
I think the core research, if you are interested, we are cooking something like this, is to try to handle the legal aspect of
Right.
small property rights house,
Right, right,
小产权
yeah.
房.
Right,
So
right.
if that can resolve, and also the land can be transferred and mortgaged, then this model of really
Collective, right.
I don't have a name on it. It's emerging that burn like wildfire
Right.
in southern China. We're going to be the dominant model of financing new urban area in China.
Right. And in fact, it was interesting, I think it was 2 years ago when we were asking one of the officials at the Beijing Planning Institute, right, 规划院, he doesn't know what to do. You know, the planners, they can't do anything because they have no rule in terms of regulatory framework. That's not set at their level. So there's quite a bit in Beijing, and so that's really a challenge in a sense, yeah.
Also, the last word, I mean, I should give you the last word. I'm really concerned about going to China using the term PPP, which
Right.
is very loaded,
Yeah.
and have a very sort of a strong Western ideology and interpretation into it. So I agree with you. All the cooperation in China are not PPP, and we shouldn't call it PPP, and we shouldn't apply PPP in China, please. So let's come up with our own term to able to create a category for our conversation and create our own sort of a public-private or whatever you call it.
Well, this is called
multi-private
private participation. Yeah. In infrastructure. So PPI refers to, that's what the World Bank now calls. It's PPI instead of PPP.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, because of time, I mean, this is wonderful. So I want to thank Professor Wu for giving us such a exciting, interesting talk. And I have a small gift to give you.
Oh, okay.
I need you to come out.
No, I'm a real member now, right? Yeah.
Remember that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, thank you for your coming. And we will invite you again for the next China lecture series will happen in April. Because it's a spring break. Yeah? Thank you so much.